Alrighty, designers, welcome to our tutorial on terrain. So this is really exciting because we're going to be able to build some really interesting looking open worlds like you're seeing here relatively easily. But the thing is that we need to understand some background information to do this the right way. So I'm going to be showing you a lot of new stuff here, but the end result is going to be really cool. And mixing this stuff with post-processing and particle effects and lighting, everything that you've learned so far is going to result in some really, really cool looking environments. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, to start things out, I'm starting with a blank scene. Feel free to do the same. In fact, I encourage you to do the same just to keep things as simple as possible. So to start off, what we are going to do is we're going to go into our hierarchy and we are going to create a 3D object and we're going to create a terrain. And by default, it is going to create this absolutely massive terrain object in our scene. And just for perspective of how large this is, I'm going to delete this main camera here and I'm going to bring in our character controller. Place him right there. Up. Focus in. So you can see this is the size of our character controller and this is the scale of the world around him. So it's relatively large. So for this first introduction to terrain, we're actually going to tone this down a little bit. So I'm going to go into the terrain settings right here. So once you click on the terrain, we're going to get the terrain settings in the inspector. And then I'm just going to click on terrain settings, which is this last tab here. And if I scroll all the way down, we're going to get to mesh resolution. We have terrain width and terrain height. It's to 1000 by default. So I'm just going to cut this in half for the width and height for both of them. Now we got a little bit more of a reasonably sized space that we'll be working in. Okay, so let me zoom out here and let's start our first step in building a terrain, which is getting the height of the terrain. So I'm going to go here to paint terrain. And under paint terrain, we have this drop down that is going to offer us a handful of different options here. We got paint holes, smooth height, stamp terrain, paint texture, set height, raise or lower terrain. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on raise or lower terrain. And we have this slew of brushes here that we can select with different effects to them. And to get a very natural looking kind of terrain, I'm actually going to select one of these cloudy looking brushes here. I think I'm going to go with this one for now. And you can see that there's a preview of it right here. And I can start painting in the terrain, but it's having way too huge of an effect. I actually don't want that. So I'm going to tone down its opacity significantly. And I'm going to increase the size to about right here. And now I'm getting a much lighter effect on the terrain. And I can just start very lightly creating the environment that I'm interested in. So what I'm going to make is kind of like this, an alcove-esque kind of thing surrounded by hills. The player will exist in this area, and then maybe there'll be some areas to explore in this direction and in that direction. So I'm just going to create some hilltops here, maybe increase the intensity just a smidge, just to give it a little bit more dynamic feeling to it, a little bit more natural. And let's go into our game view to see what that looks like. I'm gonna have to change the height and location of our character controller because he ended up right in the terrain. So I'm gonna bring him over here, lift him up, rotate him so he's facing in that direction, and let's get him close to the ground. Now we go to the game view, and now I'm kind of getting a first-person sense of what my terrain is going to look like, and already we can kind of see that this has the potential to have a very beautiful kind of look to it, which is great. So I'm fine with this. Maybe what I'll do is I'll add just some basic detail to this area here, just so it's not completely flat. So I'll select this brush actually, tone down the opacity quite a bit. Oops. More than that. I'm just going to stamp in some details like that. There we go. Perfect. This looks good to me. So let's go ahead and move on to the next step. So this was adding height to the terrain. And just some contextual information. Let's say you made a mistake here. If you want to lower the terrain, you can hold down Shift, and that will lower the terrain. So I'm pleased with that. Now let's go on and start actually painting a texture onto this terrain. So I'm just going to be using the textures that I found on Polyhaven, the PBR textures. We're just going to be using those for now, and I'm going to show you how to create two different layers of texture painting. So the first one is going to be our base layer, which is going to cover the entirety of the terrain. And then I'm going to add in another layer that's going to kind of be like this muddy look that we're going to make it look like it's, wet, using the tools inside of the texture painter. So I'm going to switch on over to paint texture. And you can see that we have this mode here for terrain layers. We currently don't have any terrain layers, so that what we're going to do is we're going to make our own terrain layers. So I'm going to click Create Layer. And what this is going to do is bring up a window where I'm going to select a texture that I want to use for this terrain layer. So what's important to note is that we aren't actually using materials to paint the terrain texture on. They are two separate things, and the terrain tools inside of Unity handle textures differently. So what we're going to do is essentially you can look at it as remaking our materials, but for the terrain tool specifically. So we're going to be selecting the individual maps that we need to build out this terrain. So I'm going to start with the base terrain, which for my scene, I'm going to go with the forest ground. Like I said, I'm just using the PBRs from Polyhaven. You do not have to use the same exact ones I'm using. You can use whichever ones you want, but you do need to make sure that you have at least a color map, or base map in Unity, and a normal map. That's very important. So I'm going to double click on forest ground, and you're going to see that it's going to fill the entire terrain with this texture. If we go into game view, we can see that this isn't looking too great because we can very, very clearly see the pattern that is created here. And we're going to fix that so that it doesn't look so, patterny. I'm going to click on this new layer, and some new options are going to show up for me under terrain layers. I can control the color tint of my color map. I can change the color map if I want. I can add a normal map, a mask map, which we're not going to worry about. And I can also change the tiling size. This is set to 2 at the moment. I'm going to bring this up to 5 by 5. And now we can see, we can still kind of see the pattern here, but it's nowhere near as obvious. Let's see, I can scale this up even further. What I want to make sure is that I'm not making this so large that things look disproportionate. So for example, like if my character is, let's go ahead and just click play and I'll show you. If my character is at this height on the ground, and if the twigs are just looking absolutely massive, it's probably too large. Like I would argue that this is too large for this character. That the grass and the sticks on the ground, they just look a little bit too big. So I'm going to tone that down just a little bit. So I'm going to change this to like I think 8 by 8, and yeah, that looks a lot better to me. So next, all I have to do is bring in the normal map. So let me find the normal map for this texture, which is right here, forest ground. And it's going to automatically add it in. And normal scale, rule of thumb, I usually always like to bump this up to 2 because it just creates a much more pronounced effect that I like. So that is what we're going to do for this one. So that's our first terrain layer. Now, what we can do is when you set your first terrain layer, it's going to set this to the entire terrain by default. But once we get into adding more layers, you're going to see that we can actually start to paint these textures right onto the terrain. So let's go ahead and make a new layer. So I'm going to click on Edit Terrain Layers, Create Layer, and this next material that I'm going to use is this like brown mud texture. So I'm going to bring this in. I'll select this and open it, and I'm going to change these settings. So I'm going to select my normal map. There it is. Bump that up to 2. Tiling, I'll just scale it to 5x5 for now. And let's see how this turns out. So now what I can do is I can select one of these brushes. Oh, so in the game view. I can select one of these brushes and I can start painting this terrain down onto the ground. So let me change my brush size. And you can see now I'm adding this texture to the texture, to the base texture. So it's on another layer. You can think of this as the base layer, and this is a layer on top of it. Now what's important is that I'm using a really soft edge brush, because what that's going to do is it's going to have a nice gradient, so it creates a nice transition between the two textures that I'm painting on here. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. So I'm going to select one of these brushes as I paint this in, just to get a much more natural look to it. Let me see where my player is. He's right over there. So I'm going to paint. Actually, let's just move in back this way. There we go. That's looking good. Okay, so I'm painting this new texture on here. Let's increase my brush size a little bit. And I'm just going to randomly scatter this around a little bit just to get some natural looking difference between the terrain and these two layers. Okay, so now let me go in and focus in on an area here. And what I want to do is I want to make this look like it's wet, like it recently rained and it's muddy. So I'm with the layer selected. I'm going to click on open. And we have these metallic and smoothness settings that we can manipulate here. I'm going to change this so that the surface is smooth, and it's going to give it like this sheen. So if we zoom in, look at the right angle here. So there we go. The light pointing at it in at the correct way. Let me just change the direction of this light. Maybe that will do it. Yeah, there we go. We can start to see a nice sheen develop on here, and the more that you increase that value, the shinier that it will look. So if I were to crank this way up, then you can really start to kind of see this like sheen develop on top of it, and it looks like the ground is wet. So it's a little bit too exaggerated. I'm going to tone that down to like about right there. There we go. That's looking good. That's about what I'm looking for. Excellent. Let's hit play and observe our ground. We got some great looking textures here, and this is looking really good. Well on our way to creating a good looking scene. So I really like the process of creating terrain and texture painting, because once you have all the tools and all the assets that you need, it's very relaxing to do. Actually, it's, you know, it kind of reminds me of like putting together a Bob Ross kind of landscape. All right, but let's move on into adding trees and grass to this scene. So to do that, we're actually going to be using an asset from the asset store to do this. So I'm going to show you exactly which one I want you guys to get. So let me pull this up. Window, asset store, search online. Polytope Studio. Here it is right here. So low poly environment, nature free medieval fantasy series. So this is what you're going to add to your Unity project. And go ahead and just import everything automatically. Or I should say import everything that is included in this asset. my scene. So once you add that asset from the asset store, it will show up in your assets packages. And you're just going to click download and import. Now the important step that you need to make sure you do here is once it is installed, it is going to add a Polytope Studios folder to your project. And what you're going to do is you're going to open up low poly environments inside that folder and then SRP. Now what's happening here is that this is using the default shaders by the built-in shaders. I'm sorry. It is using the built-in shaders in Unity by default. So what that means is that we need to load the version of this that is using the universal render pipeline shaders so that it will work correctly. Because right out the box, none of the materials are going to import in correctly. They're all going to be pink, which we don't want. So we need to make sure that we are selecting the, I believe it's the 14, yep, this one right here. So it's the last one, environments, SRP, PT nature free, URP, 14.0.9 Unity package. So I'm going to double click that and it's going to come up with this. I'm going to import everything. So once that is imported, all of the materials will import correctly now and we can start using this stuff to fill our environment with objects. So the very first thing that we're going to start with are the trees. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to select my terrain here. And I'm going to go to the paint trees section, and you can see that we have no trees defined. I'm going to click on edit trees and add tree. And here we are going to see this window come up and it says please assign a tree, and we're going to select a game object for this. I'm just going to search for tree, and we have a handful of options from this asset that we installed. But there's one in particular that I'm looking for. I want this PT Pine Tree 03 green, and I want the prefab for it. So it's going to be this little box icon here, not the box that has like the little tape looking icon, but the prefab, which is just the box with all four blue sides. The other one has like a gray side to it. This one, all three sides of it are blue. So it's called PT Pine Tree 03 Green, and this is what I'm going to bring in. And you're going to see a setting here for nav mesh LOD index. Just leave that to last, and I'm going to explain what LOD is here in just a second. So I'm going to click on add. And as you can see here, I can just start to paint in trees. Obviously this is way too dense, and that's not going to work for us because there's a couple things that we need to make changes to first. But let me show you, for example. So let's turn down this tree density, and I'm just going to place some trees right here. You go ahead and hit play. And you can see that I can just walk right through these trees. We need to add a capsule collider to this prefab in order for this to work properly. So we're going to do that in just a bit. But there's a few things I need to explain here. One is that a lot of times when you install things from the asset store, it is going to come included with custom-made shaders from the, whatever company or individual made this asset. So if I'm just going to type in shader here, and these are the shaders that came pre-installed with this asset. Now, as you know, we're already using a shader in this project to make our materials. We've been using the Autodesk Interactive Shader. Now, what a shader is essentially is a set of instructions to tell a certain material to do something specific. So for example, let's say you wanted to add an effect to a material that had a pulsing like glow to it. That's what creating a shader is for, is adding custom effects to materials. Now you can see that this asset has some effects applied to it. You can see that the tree is moving on its own as if it's blowing in the wind. Now the shader is controlling that. The shader is what is responsible for this effect that's occurring on this asset. Now it's important to note, quick side note, is that the terrain tools have this built into them. If you go into settings, you can actually control the wind speed and everything like that for things that don't have any wind settings built into their shaders. This does, so we're not going to be using this. But going back, let's take a look at this game object, or this prefab. So I'm going to bring in, is this the one? Yes, Pine Tree 03 Green. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this prefab, I'm going to put it right here into our scene so I can explain LODs to everybody. So this prefab has 3 sub-assets assigned to it, something called LOD0, LOD1, and LOD2. Now what LOD stands for is level of detail. So what this means is that based on how far away I am from this object, a different mesh is going to load in based on how far away I am. So by default, we are using just the standard stock mesh, just the original mesh, LOD0, that has 1026 triangles. And it has 2 submeshes, the leaves and the trunk of the tree. So you can see here in the inspector, I have this little very convenient graph showing me what LOD I'm currently at. So as I zoom out, you can see the camera is moving along with it, and it is telling me which LOD I am using based on my distance. So at LOD0, I'm using the base mesh with 1026 triangles. As I am moving out, eventually I hit LOD1, and it is a 65% total of the mesh. And then if I move out to LOD2, it's a 45% reduction. Or I'm sorry, like that's the amount of detail. So I have 65% of the detail LOD1, LOD2 I have 45% of the detail. So as I move away and away, eventually the object is called, meaning that it is not rendered. So you can see everything disappears once I got to this distance. Everything's gone. There's nothing there. So you use LOD for multiple things. One, it allows us to mass place objects inside of a terrain while supporting rotation. So for example, let's say none of these assets had LODs on them. That would mean if we were to place all of these trees using a method I'm about to show you, none of them would randomly rotate in space. They would all have the same exact rotation, so it would become very obvious that there's a pattern emerging with these assets, that they all look like they're the same tree. We don't want that. We want that rotation so it looks a lot more natural, a lot more organic. But this also helps with performance. If we were rendering everything all the time, no matter what distance we were away from it, it's going to take a huge performance hit on our computers, and it's going to be really difficult and intensive for it to run our games. We don't want that. We want it to dynamically swap in these lower res meshes based on our distance so that the game continues to run smooth no matter where we are in our terrain. So let me go ahead and I'm going to leave this here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the terrain, back to the tree. I'm going to hold down shift and I'm going to erase these trees, because what we need to do is we need to add a capsule collider to this prefab and make a new prefab for it so that we can run into these trees and not just walk right through them. So I'm actually going to select this tree, edit trees, and remove tree. Now I am here, and we are going to work on these individual LODs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select LOD0. I'm going to go to Add Component, and I'm going to select Capsule Collider, and it is going to create this Capsule Collider around our tree object. And what I'm going to do is under radius, I'm just going to shrink that down so that it's just around the size of the trunk of the tree. Each LOD is its unique mesh. You can see here in the project folder that we have each of the LODs here. Let me find it. 03 green. Here we go. So here's LOD 0 for pine tree 03 green. Here's LOD 1, and here's LOD 2. These are each unique meshes. Or I should say, this game object has these built into it. You can set LODs in 3D editing software, so whoever made this implemented, I'm assuming they used Blender, they implemented the LODs in Blender and exported to Unity, so this asset came with LODs pre-built in. So now what we need to do is add a Capsule Collider for the LOD 0. Actually, we don't need to add it for LOD 1 or 2 because if we're close enough to the object to touch it, it's going to be using LOD 1. So we just need to add it to LOD 0. So back to this prefab, what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this as a new prefab in a new folder that I'm going to create, and I'm just going to call it edited prefabs. So we'll open this up, and I'm going to select this object here from my hierarchy, and I'm going to drag it into this folder, and I'm going to save it as an original prefab. And let me go ahead and give this a new name. I'm going to call this PT Pine, so we know that it has a Capsule Collider on it. So let me delete this, and let's just make sure this is working. I'm going to drag in our capsule, and we can see, sure enough, it has that Capsule Collider on there, so we are good to go. So delete the game object. Let's go back to our terrain. We're going to click on Edit Trees, Add Trees, and we are going to search for our tree with the Capsule Collider, which is right here. Double click, add, and before we mass place these trees, let's just go ahead and do a quick test and make sure that the Capsule Collider is working. And sure enough it is. I'm colliding with that tree, so we are good to go. So hold out Shift and erase. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to mass place the tree. So this is really cool. We can have Unity dynamically place all of these trees throughout this environment using random sizes and rotations and all that kind of stuff within a certain range. So by default, it's going to place 10,000. That's a little much. We don't need that many. I'm going to reduce that to, let's say, 6,000. So you can see here that our scene has now been filled with our tree prefab, which is awesome. It's looking really good. So we're going to do the same exact thing for a different type of tree now. So what I'm going to do is go back to my assets folder. I'm going to search for tree, and I want to make a version of this really cool fall looking tree right here. So I'm going to drag this prefab in. It has this just beautiful, nice, vibrant colors to it. And well, since I'm already in here, let's go ahead and start talking about how you can change shader settings. Because you can see here, if I go and open this up, under LOD 0, you can see the shaders applied here, or the materials. We have Fruit Tree Opaque material and Generic Tree Leaves material 2, but you can see that they're using the shaders from Polytope Studio. Specifically, they're using the Vegetation Opaque shader and Vegetation Foliage shader. So this is what is controlling those wind settings there. If I click down on this material, you can see that I have access to custom colors tinting, which is how they're achieving this fall looking effect to it, because this is the original texture right here, just these leaves, but they've enabled custom color tinting, so that's how they're doing that. You can change gradient, you can change the intensity of the wind and all that kind of stuff right here in these settings. Now remember, this is tied to the shader specifically, so if anything else is using the Vegetation Foliage shader, whatever you change here is also going to apply to that other shader. So it's very important to remember that. This isn't tied to the material specifically. It's tied to the shader. These settings are tied to the vegetation foliage shader specifically, not the material that it's assigned to. Same thing for the vegetation opaque shader right here. These settings are tied to the shader, not the material. Very important to understand that. All right. So we need to add a capsule collider to this guy right here. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to select the LOD 0 under the inspector, and I'm just going to add a capsule collider and reduce the radius to right about, let's say there, and I need to change its location. So center, let's move it there. It's like right there. I think that's good. Oh, no, on. Let me go to top view. This is going to be easier to do if I'm top view. Just more that way. There we go. That's good for me. So now I'll go back to my assets folder. And I will go to edited prefabs, and I'm going to bring this tree right in, original prefab, and we're good to go. Just delete this from the scene, go back to our terrain, and we're going to add a tree. Oh wait, first let me rename it. BT fruit tree capsule. Go add. Now zoom out, and we're going to mass place these trees as well. For this one, I just want 3,000 of them. Existing trees, place. There we go. And just like that, we have a very, very visually beautiful scene that we can work with. And you can see that we have overlapping on some of these trees, which is totally fine because we can go in and make individual changes to that wherever we see a problem. So let's find one of those problems. Here we go. This one has too much overlay. I can reduce my brush size to, as small as I can go. And I can hold down shift. I'm just going to select this tree because I'm going to get rid of this one. Actually, let's get rid of let's get rid of that one because it's right next to another one. Hold down shift and just click. And there we go. That's removed. So if you see any trees that are just like behaving oddly, you can just manually erase them. Just easy to do. So now what we're going to do is let's paint in, before we start adding grass, let's paint in some kind of interesting, trail for our player to follow using this mud texture. So let's select here and select the terrain, and let's paint more of this terrain here. Let's say I want the player to, there we go, follow this route where they're going to go here, through here, over in this direction like that. So I'm just going to start painting in that route. Go around the tree a little bit like that. Just to get kind of a basic path going. And you can, obviously add other, roots and things like that. And you can add other materials on top of this. So what I think would be a fantastic idea is to find like a cobblestone texture on Polyhaven, add it as another layer, and paint that on top of that. So I'd let you guys do that. And that would look really, really good. So yeah, take the time to paint out, this kind of like basic trail or something that you want the player to follow. And this will give you some guidelines of where to place your grass. So let's go ahead and start talking about how to actually place grass. that I will save for part 2 of this introduction to terrain. So that's going to be it for this one, and we will talk about adding grass in the next video.